This kind of hysterical excitement selects for its victims impressionable people with sensitive nerves. It attacks children more frequently than adults, and women more frequently than men. Vivacious and quickly responsive temperaments are more subject to it than those that are phlegmatic and slow. Under suitable circumstances, it easily develops into a thoroughly morbid mental state, in which convulsive movements are attended by partial and temporary hallucinations. The nervous impressions become so vivid that ideas are clothed with externality and mistaken for realities. Such are the characteristics of hysteria and allied forms of mental disturbance, which differ from true insanity in being merely temporary and functional, and not connected with any organic lesion. They are very striking phenomenon and often very shocking, but not more mysterious than many other phases of abnormal mental life. It was not strange that an ignorant age should have called them the result of witchcraft. That same age, we must remember, regarded ordinary insanity as the direct work of the devil. Applying these considerations to the case of the Salem girls, we may suppose that the minister's West Indian servants began by talking Indian medicine and teaching its tricks to his daughter and niece. Then the girls of their acquaintance would naturally become interested, and would seek to relieve the monotony of the winter evenings by taking part in the performances. Their first motives are most likely to have been playful, but there was probably a half-shuddering sense of wickedness, a slight aroma of brimstone about the affair, which may have made it the more attractive. I feel sure that sooner or later some of those girls would find themselves losing control over their spasms, and thus, getting more than they had bargained for, would deem themselves bewitched by Tituba and John Indian. But, especially if they found themselves taken to task by their parents, the dread of punishment, perhaps of church discipline, wherein Paris was notably severe, would be sure to make them blame the Indians in order to screen themselves. If Cotton Mather's methods had now been followed, the affair would have been hushed, and the girls, isolated from each other, would have been subjected to quiet and soothing treatment, and thus no doubt it would have all ended. But when Paris made the affair as public as possible, when learned doctors of divinity and medicine came and watched those girls, and declared them bewitched, what more was needed to convince their young minds that they were really in that dreadful plight? Such a belief must of course have added to their hysterical condition. Naturally they accused Tituba, and as for the two old women, Good and Osborne, very likely some of the girls may really have been afraid of them as evil-eyed or otherwise uncanny. For the rest of the story, a guiding influence is needed, and I think we may find it in Mrs. Putnam. She was one of the Carrs of Salisbury, a family which for several generations had been known as extremely nervous and excitable. There had been cases of insanity among her near relatives. The deaths of some of her own children and of a beloved sister, with other distressing events, had clouded her mind. She had once been the most sparkling and brilliant of women, but was sinking into melancholia at the time when the first stories of witchcraft came from the parsonage, and she learned that her little daughter, Anne, a precocious and imaginative child, was one of the afflicted. Mrs. Putnam and her husband were both firm believers in witchcraft. I do not think it strange that her diseased mind should have conjured up horrible fancies about Goodwife Nurse, member of a family which she probably hated all the more bitterly for the high esteem in which it was generally held. Mrs. Putnam fell into violent hysterical fits like her daughter, and their bright and active servant, Mercy Lewis, was afflicted likewise. These three, with the minister's niece Abigail Williams and her friend Mary Walcott, were the most aggressive and driving agents in the whole tragedy. I presume Mrs. Putnam may have exercised something like what it is now fashionable to call hypnotic influence over the young girls. She honestly believed that witches were hurting them all, and she naturally suspected foes rather than friends. I see no good reason for doubting that she fully believed her own ghost stories, or that the children believed theirs. In their exalted state of mind, they could not distinguish between what they really saw and what they vividly fancied. It was analogous to what often occurs in delirium. Such an explanation of the witchcraft in Salem Village accounts for the facts much better than any such violent supposition as that of conscious conspiracy. Our fit attitude of mind toward it is pity for all concerned, yet the feelings of horror and disgust are quite legitimate, for the course of the affair was practically the same as if it had been shaped by deliberate and conscious malice. It is on the whole the most gruesome episode in American history, and it sheds back a lurid light upon the long tale of witchcraft in the past. Few instances of the delusion have attracted so much attention as this at Salem, and few have had the details so fully and minutely preserved. It was the last witch epidemic recorded in the history of fully civilized nations. It occurred among people of our own sort, and the sixth generation, born since it happened, has not yet passed away. It came just as the superstition which produced it was about to die out from the thoughts of educated men, and there is no monument more conspicuous than the Salem witchcraft to mark the remote and fast receding side of the gulf which the human mind has traversed in these 2 centuries. For these reasons, it looms up in our memory and is sometimes alluded to as if it were in some way a singular or exceptional instance of superstition. Yet in Europe, only a few years earlier, the hanging of 19 persons for witchcraft in a single village and in the course of a single summer would have called forth no special comment. The case of Salem Village may help us in the attempt to form some dim conception of the stupendous wickedness that must have been wrought by the terrible delusion in the days of its stalwart prime, when victims by the hundred were burned at the stake. We can but faintly imagine what must have been the destruction of confidence, the breaking of the dearest ties, the madness, the reign of savage terror, and we cannot be too grateful that the gaunt spectre which stalked so long over the fairest parts of the earth has at length been exorcised forever.